Hi everyone, I'm Anna, and I'm new. You can't do that while I'm doing it.
Oh, I didn't realize this was.
What?
This is a real one. Okay.
This is a real one.
I'm sorry.
Hi everyone, I'm Anna, and I'm new to TypeScript. I am new to TypeScript. It can definitely be scary admitting you're new to something, and this has pretty much been the theme of my last 18 months. A year and a half ago, I changed careers and decided to become a software engineer, to start as a beginner in a new field. And here, I find myself as a speaker at the TypeScript conference, my first big speaking opportunity ever. I'm still on my own journey to feel comfortable as a beginner, as an engineer, and in anything. But my experience the last few months learning TypeScript has been really important to my path to becoming a confident engineer and a proud beginner with any new technology. My game plan for today is that I'll share a little bit about my path to programming and how an early introduction to computer science shaped my experience breaking into software engineering later on. I'll talk about my first time in a TypeScript file, what I came into the language knowing, and how I really misunderstood TypeScript at first. I'll talk about how overcoming roadblocks in TypeScript helped me to develop a framework for getting through challenges in the language. I'll share that framework with you, and how the framework helped me turn TypeScript into my most helpful pairing buddy, especially as I came to understand the true power of the language. My hope is that you'll come away with these 5 steps for moving through roadblocks in TypeScript for people new to programming, new to TypeScript, and for those managing people new to coding in TypeScript. I'll share my learnings, how to get through those roadblocks when learning TypeScript or any new language. I hope to convey the real power of TypeScript and why I think it's awesome and why the value prop that most resonated with me was different from what I originally heard going in. And I'll talk a bit about facing challenges in your career and learning new technologies, especially when it comes to engineering from non-traditional backgrounds. So to start off, my path to programming, where that fear of being a beginner originally began, and how hitting setbacks early on in my journey really primed me to feel like I didn't know what I was doing, a feeling that I would come back to early on in my time as an engineer and learning TypeScript. So, intro to roadblocks. We humans, we like to plan. We like predictability. We like knowing what's on the path ahead. But if this year has taught us anything, it's that you can't really do that. The world is constantly throwing unwelcome surprises that get in the way of all of our plans. And one of the core experiences of any software engineer is feeling blocked. So what does it mean to be blocked as an engineer? It's when you hit a point in your code and you're not sure how to proceed, when there's a bug you really can't figure out no matter how hard you try, or a concept you just can't understand. In my opinion, programming is really all about hitting roadblocks. So building the skills to overcome them is core to growing as an engineer. For me, encountering hurdles really fueled my fear of being a beginner. It became this vicious cycle of hitting a roadblock, feeling uncomfortable, and further building fear of starting as a beginner, hitting more roadblocks, and so on. Here's how the cycle started for me. 10 years ago, I moved from New York to Berkeley, California to study on a campus with people, some of whom would go on to build some of the biggest tech companies that would define our everyday. I remember when Uber was launching its first few cars across the bay in San Francisco, and the social network had just come out, and I was really excited about the tech world. I wanted in. And to me, programming seemed like this really great mix of problem solving and creative building, and a skill that would open up a lot of doors for me. But this is what my class looked like. It was huge, thousands of students, primarily male identifying, and as I would come to learn throughout these courses, most of them had some prior experience coding before finding themselves here, as in they were not beginners. I really struggled in these classes. While I was taking these introductory classes, I had a lot of other interests on campus, from art history to writing about art for the school newspaper. I was in a sorority and a student co-op, and I really could not see myself spending all night in the computer lab, which honestly is what I needed to make it through these classes. After my third computer science class, an idea was bashing me over the head. Computer science isn't for me. I don't look like these people. I don't share the same interests as them. At the time, I really felt like I was not as smart as them. Ultimately, I decided to drop the computer science major and dive into my humanities interests. Since I became a software engineer, I've been told that making it through even those first few classes would qualify me to be an entry-level computer science for an entry-level computer science role. But getting knocked down and not believing in myself caused me to veer away from programming pretty early in my story, and really only by chance did I end up finding my way back. After I graduated from Berkeley, I moved to New York and joined a company called Artsy, a startup in the art world with an incredible engineering team. At Artsy, the coolest people at the company were software engineers. They were really talented technologists, but also loved the things I loved, like art and music, and they loved sharing their knowledge with other people. They even had this elective programming course that they ran during the workday for non-engineers. I obviously took that class. And a big part of my job on communications was helping to share the software that they built with the world. Any chance I had to collaborate with them, I jumped at it. I was so close to the magic of engineering, but at the same time, also very far away. I was so interested in what the product team was doing that I asked to transfer over to their team. And shortly after that, there was a big restructuring at the company with new leadership, and I actually got laid off. Getting laid off was really hard, but it was kind of exactly what I needed to push me to make a big change in my career. A few weeks later, I decided to enroll in a coding bootcamp in New York and was back on the path I started on my freshman year of college. Somewhat to my surprise, I totally fell in love with coding. I met a lot of people from all different kinds of backgrounds, career changers like me. I discovered that writing code was both creative and highly structured. It was really fun, but also really frustrating, and the amount I could learn seemed infinite. It was not without its challenges, of course. Hitting a roadblock, whether getting my butt kicked in university computer science or getting laid off from my first job, really familiarizes me with the feelings of failure, and also made it easy to come back to the feeling of, holy shit, I have no idea what I'm doing. When I couldn't figure out a bug in my code or grasp a new concept, I would experience these feelings that I wasn't smart enough, I wasn't good enough, and these would later come up for me when I was learning TypeScript. After bootcamp, I ended up getting hired back at Artsy as an engineer in November of last year. And in my first few weeks on the job, I encountered a lot of new technologies. We're a React and Ruby on Rails shop, which I did know from my coding bootcamp, but parts of our stack like GraphQL and TypeScript were completely new to me. I was always asking a million questions and felt like, yes, indeed, I have no idea what I was doing. So here we are, Anna meets TypeScript. A little context on the history of Artsy and TypeScript. We've been using TypeScript in most of our front-end code for the last 5 or so years before I joined the engineering team. And in my first few days back at Artsy as an engineer, I read a blog post by Orta, an Artsy alum and another speaker today, and of course a big evangelist for TypeScript at Artsy. The post explained the basics of the language and why we use it at the company. Back in the giant lecture hall in college, one of the concepts that later proved useful was learning the difference between a statically and dynamically typed language. And one of these introductory courses was taught in Java. So that's where I learned the very basic idea that when you declare a variable as an integer and you assign it to an integer, all good. But if you assign it to a string, you get a compilation error. The blog post that I just mentioned compares TypeScript to Java, which works kind of in a similar way, declaring a variable as type integer, assigning it to an integer, again, good, but if you assign it to a string or change it later on, you get a compilation error. This post also talked about how TypeScript gave developers at Artsy a lot of assurance that the changes that they made in one part of the code didn't have unexpected and negative consequences elsewhere, and that this brought a lot of value to the team. The point reflected a conversation I had heard happening at a company that I interned for right after my boot camp. And their engineering team was debating converting their React front end, which was in regular JavaScript, over to TypeScript. And to me, the debate really boiled down to the bandwidth, overhead, and extra time needed to do this conversion versus the safety that TypeScript brings to a code base, really reducing the likelihood of bugs coming into the code, and the same idea that's reflected in that blog post I mentioned. I'm sure a lot of other companies have had this debate, are having it now, and this is the primer I had coming in when I opened my first TypeScript file. I'm going to walk us through a code example inspired by a task I had in my first few weeks on the job in my very, very, very early days working with TypeScript. The example is pared down and simplified, but I hope it gives you a sense of my thought process, what was going through my head as I worked through my first TypeScript code. The part of the website that we'll look at is the artwork page. At Artsy, we sell millions of artworks, so there's millions of pages that just look just like this on Artsy, and we're going to talk about the section on the right that includes different pieces of information about the artwork. We'll zoom in on a part of this that talks about the dimensions, the height, width, depth of a work. And this is kind of what that component looks like to show all of that artwork information. We have our props defined in an interface at the top. We have our component definition. And we have this box that renders the dimensions. The task I'll talk you through today is a little refactor of moving this section into its own dimensions component. I started by writing the new component as if it was regular React, starting from what I knew, and we're formatting a string from the dimensions to show in a text box on the page. But here, this yellow squiggly line appears. Some light annoyance, but maybe a little panic starts to set in. I know I have some work ahead of me. I pretty hastily went into the parent component, did some pattern matching, copy and pasted the function definition to say we're returning a React functional component. But now we have this red squiggly line. When I saw these red or yellow squiggly lines, I would often hear this voice in my head. You did something wrong. You broke something. You're not good at this. It was like this TypeScript monster was waving its hand in my face saying, haha, you're bad at this. Again, with pattern matching and some frantic typing, I typed out the props, copying from the parent file. And at this point, I was feeling pretty good. No errors. The next step was to add a new dimension to the page. Say I wanted to add something like frame width. So if the work has a frame, indicating how big that frame is, and put that in the component. In regular React land, I know that the props coming in will have frame width on the artwork because the artwork model in our database has frame width on it, but it's TypeScript. Another squiggly line pops up. Okay, I add the new dimension to the prop definition, feeling pretty good about myself for figuring that out. But of course, not so easy. I see there's a new error in the parent file that we were looking at first, where I render the dimensions component. I'm starting to feel like this poor little guy whack-a-moling all of these errors. I fix one and another one pops up. As I fix these errors, going up the component tree, I would create more errors. And in components I wasn't even working in or trying to touch. This process, and also dealing with more complex type errors, made me feel like I was breaking everything. This is when the TypeScript monster would reveal his darker side. He was no longer just an annoying pest, but actually making me a little scared that I was never going to squash all of these errors, and that I really didn't know how to even write React. At best, it felt like something to check off my to-do list, TypeScript adding maybe 20 to 30% of extra time to my development flow. And in its worst moments, these squiggly lines from TypeScript made me feel like I was a bad developer. At this point, when I thought back to the time versus safety argument, I was pretty squarely on team anti-TypeScript. I wasn't really experiencing the upside. The roadblocks were getting to me, and I needed to find a better way to work through these errors that actually helped me learn the language. Here's how I learned how to overcome TypeScript roadblocks and become a more comfortable TypeScript beginner. When I encountered the TypeScript monster, one of my first instincts was often to ask for help. I think a lot of early career engineers struggle with asking for help. Either they ask for help too soon, or they're afraid to ask for help at all. I have definitely fallen in both camps. Asking for help can feel like the easy way out, and now you're admitting defeat. I also was often afraid to waste other people's time or expose myself as less skilled or smart than maybe they had originally thought when they hired me. Creating a culture that really encourages people to ask for help is really important to me and critical to any engineering organization. Unfortunately, pairing is a big part of my everyday at Artsy, one of the most important parts of our engineering culture. But what I got wrong at the beginning, and I think a lot of engineers get wrong, is when to ask for help. TypeScript taught me a beneficial framework for working through roadblocks myself, and also for prepping me to ask for assistance to help others unblock me. So walking through the same components we looked at, I'll trace through the thought process I landed on for getting through a TypeScript hurdle. Number 1, take a breath. I see the red squiggly lines, and instead of racing to get rid of the error and frantically typing pattern matching in the file, I make sure to slow down. Next, I actually hover over the error and read it slowly, and read it a few times. TypeScript errors can be a little hard to read and intimidating at first, but as I slowed down and read them closely and got more used to the language, I was able to see that the error is telling me exactly what to do. Number 3, read the documentation. TypeScript has a lot of really helpful docs that walk you through common issues and topics that actually explain why the language is structured the way that it is and why these errors pop up. I even came across this paragraph that helped validate my fear of being a TypeScript beginner. Facing weird type errors, you aren't alone. That is the hardest part of using TypeScript with React. Be patient. You're learning a new language after all. I'm a beginner. However, the more you get good at this, the less time you'll be working against the compiler, and the more the compiler will be working for you. A really key point here. How do I get TypeScript to work for me? Spending some time reading through the documentations and the errors got me thinking about how much time I spend reading as an engineer. And sometimes I actually felt self-conscious about this, that I was reading more than I was writing code. And I thought being a programmer was about writing code. This aha moment, and something they don't teach you at bootcamp, was coding is as much about reading as it is about writing. But not just reading documentation and errors, actually being in your editor and reading the code itself. This thought brought me to a big turning point in my TypeScript learning process and how TypeScript became my most helpful pairing buddy. A couple months later, I found myself back in the component I had built out in TypeScript, and because I had to reuse it in another part of the code. And reading through the TypeScript component, I could immediately grasp what was happening inside. In just a few quick seconds, I had a really thorough understanding of the component's purpose, what data was being passed in, what the structure of that data looked like. It was like the interface was my own personal treasure map key. And the component definition was like a blueprint guide for building the next thing. And as I started off in my presentation, I was just so excited to build things. The editor also surfaces all of this documentation, autocomplete, and actually does a lot of the work for you. It felt like magic. So number 4, read the code. And that's what made the TypeScript monster my friend, my most helpful pairing buddy, who silently guided me through my development work. Having the TypeScript monster by my side, my most helpful pairing buddy, I felt empowered to make it through TypeScript roadblocks. But also when the TypeScript monster couldn't quite get me through, he made me infinitely better at asking questions. By reading the error, the documentation, the code, I came armed with a lot of extra context and knowledge to bring to my colleagues. And because my questions were a lot more informed and more thoughtful, my team members were able to unblock me way quicker. So that's where we get to number 5, ask for help. These 5 steps completely shifted my experience with TypeScript. When I thought back to the original debate of time versus safety and how I understood this to be the primary trade-off with TypeScript, I realized that what I was missing from the argument was the tools and concepts TypeScript has built into the language and how it integrates into my editor to help me through. The journey of learning the true power of TypeScript for me accelerated my learning and made me a much more confident TypeScript developer. A key realization for me that I hope others learning new technologies take away, and again for their managers too, is that when learning a new technology, I really need to deeply understand why the language is powerful for me. Not just what I hear from Twitter or blog posts or other engineers on my team. I had to understand this power and then experience it firsthand. I've come a long way from the shakiness I first experienced when I opened my first TypeScript file and felt the uneasiness and the imposter syndrome that's so common in our industry, and especially with people from non-traditional backgrounds. Walking through my 5 steps for overcoming TypeScript hurdles and really experiencing firsthand why TypeScript is so powerful for me made me a much more confident developer. And now I feel empowered to move into this next phase of TypeScript learning because I know I've really only just scratched the surface. It makes me excited to tackle all of these roadblocks head on and to really own being a beginner with TypeScript and with any new technology. Thank you so much to you all for listening in and to the TypeScript conference for taking a chance on a beginner. Please feel free to reach out to me. I love talking about breaking into tech, career changers, diversity in software engineering, and learning new technologies. I'd like to thank my friend Michelle Kersner for dreaming up our friend the TypeScript monster, as well as the awesome devs at Artsy, past and present, including Orta, who not only spread TypeScript at Artsy, but was an early proponent of me further exploring my love of programming. Also, Artsy is hiring, so come write TypeScript with me.